Good evening, everybody. Hey, thanks very much for coming along. It's wonderful to see such a big turnout for tonight's event. So, Kingmaker is going to be the theme for today, and it's with great pleasure to introduce the speaker we have, Sonia Purnell, who is one of Britain's most preeminent journalists and biographers, who's produced a whole range of fascinating work in the last 10 years or so, biographies of important people, famous people, and also neglected and people we don't know so much about, political figures and cultural figures, historical figures, who maybe aren't at the forefront of our minds, but maybe should be. And her most recent book, as we can see, Kingmaker, about Pamela Churchill Harriman, who's a fascinating character who we're going to learn a lot about this evening. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Sonia. Welcome. Thank you for coming tonight.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
Thank you so much. Thanks for coming up, and I'm sure it'll be an interesting event. Let's open with a few questions. We're going to do this in a conversational style. So the idea would be, I've got a few questions prepared. We can also got a roving mic here that can go around when the time comes to get some questions from the audience as well. We want to make it as interactive as we can, rather than some kind of lecture format. We want it to be a conversational format. So at any point, if there's a question on your mind, I'll also ask at certain points. But think about a couple of questions, and I'll call upon people to have a talk to the mic. And also, a lot of people don't want to use the mic, but it works best not just for the room, but for the recording, because this is going to go onto YouTube, and without the mic, it just doesn't work. So yeah, do use the mic when it circles around. Okay. So with that in mind, I'm sure some of you will be familiar with the book, others will be less familiar. Sonia, can I ask you to open by saying a few words about who was Pamela and why you wrote this book about her? What kind of character is she? Just introduce Pamela to the audience.
So Pamela was the eldest child of Lord and Lady Digby. She grew up in deepest, darkest rural Dorset. Her parents had moved there after the last pandemic because, just like we've seen in recent years, they wanted to get away from the city. They sold their house in London, and she grew up in a valley where you can see no other lights at night, even today. They, by aristocratic standards anyway, didn't have much cash, so they rather hoped that she would go off and marry a much richer lord and bring some money to the family, and she was brought up really entirely for that purpose. So virtually no education. Her spelling was terrible, her maths even worse. She eventually got sent away to school after insisting for years, where she was taught domestic science, which I'm sure you know is just a posh word for sewing and cooking, and she had no intention of doing either, so that was a bit of a waste of time. What she did want to do, and she was totally fascinated by politics. So she's coming into her sort of formative years in the 1930s. Her father never wants to discuss Hitler. He was badly injured in the First War. He really couldn't believe there might be another one. Politics generally was taboo at home. Her ancestor had been part of the gunpowder plot, and they thought that's the sort of thing that happens if you get too involved in affairs of state. So she was very much forbidden from discussing or asking about politics. But her other great obsession was another ancestor by the name of Jane Digby, who was a notorious courtesan, 19th century courtesan, slept with various kings and the king's sons, French novelists, Albanian brigands, Syrian princes, a whole bunch of people. Had a tremendous time, I think, and Pamela wanted to know more about her, and there was a very intimate diary, but unfortunately for Pamela, her parents burnt all the juicy bits, leaving only the boring bit at the beginning, so all she had to go on was a portrait of this ancestor, which was, however, banished to the back stairs because it was all considered rather embarrassing. So she knew about this exciting life that people had. She was fascinated by politics. She had no formal education to speak of. She was just desperate to get away from Dorset into the great world at large. Now, she met Hitler very briefly when she was sent to be finished, as they called it, in Munich in 1937. Extraordinary choice, you might think, but a lot of very posh young ladies were sent there to be polished. The idea being that German culture was disciplined and, necessary. So extraordinary thinking back then, of course. But so she was just out for adventure, but most of all, adventure on the world stage. And the only way that she could see to achieve this, after having a season as a debutante complete failure, she wanted to talk about Hitler. This is not the sort of thing that young ladies did. And she also couldn't squeeze into those dresses with 17-inch waists. It just wasn't going to happen for Pamela. So she got nowhere. And then when war broke out in 1939, we have this extraordinary sliding doors moment where a phone call comes in from Winston Churchill's son, Randolph. Oh, by the way, her father thought that Churchills were political racketeers and should never come anywhere near his daughters. But Randolph phoned her. He had asked 8 women to marry him in the previous fortnight because he wanted to sire a son before, Churchill's only had sons in his view, before going off to war. They'd all said quite wisely, no thank you. Now he was going to try Pamela. He knew that she'd had a failed season. So he took her out to Quaglino's, did not try this at home, for dinner, ignored her all the way until coffee, spoke to everyone else in the room apart for her, finally swung round, looked at her intently and said, "You look healthy enough to bear my son. Will you marry me?" Well, amazingly, Pamela said yes, because she was desperate to get into the big wide world. And therein is the beginning of a life of extraordinary adventure and power and seduction and intrigue, as that title suggests.
That's a wonderful answer, thank you. And it's quite a lot to digest already, and she's only just got married, right? The book unfolds in all kinds of different directions. It's what's so interesting about it. I mean, I hadn't come across I didn't say anything about my background. I forgot to say I was at the start of the talk, but I'm an academic here, and I'm a professor of management, so I'm interested in a lot of management figures, leadership figures, and we get the same kind of people, the same menu, time and time again, right? A leader is a male figure, a leader is Churchill, or a leader is Jack Welch of General Electric, or something of that nature. And this idea of a biography of a woman with no real credentials to be involved at the highest levels of politics and state, etc., but becomes intimately connected with these, right? So could you say a bit more about this, the trajectory of Pamela in terms of moving into areas of power when really she's got no obvious route?
It is extraordinary. So, like you say, it's not obvious at all. So she gets married at 19. Randolph Churchill, I don't know whether you know much about him, turns out to be a complete rogue, a drunken brute. His father, who's completely indulged him, now starts pushing him away. At the beginning of the war, I'm sure you know, Churchill is not Prime Minister, but becomes so in 1940. She's pregnant by this time with a son, young Winston, but she moves into Downing Street with him. So he's pushing his son away. But the extraordinary thing is that he realizes this very young woman, only now 20, has an incredible brain. She kind of soaks up information. She's endlessly curious. She's also endlessly supportive, and that didn't, was not the case with that many people at that point. And so he sees in her this helpmeet, which he's, I think, quite unexpectedly found and hasn't found amongst his own children. His daughters get very jealous of Pamela because she's included in high-level dinners with de Gaulle or generals or admirals. But even more importantly, and this happens very quickly after she gives birth, she is involved in the most important operation of all, and that is Operation Seduction USA. As soon as Churchill becomes Prime Minister, he knows we're not going to survive without American help. We just are not. There is no way. America not terribly keen to get involved, though. They got involved in the First War. They really don't want to get involved in what they see at this point as another just European spat. Why do those crazy Europeans keep fighting each other? So public opinion was against it. Congress was against it. FDR is a bit equivocal. What could Pamela do? Well, her Her move was, with Churchill, all choreographed. These amazing Cecil Beaton pictures are taken of her with her baby, and they are given to Life magazine, who runs them on the front page, and endless spreads inside. You should see the reader letters. These are the most beautiful pictures you've ever run, the readers say to Life magazine. Oh, perhaps we should try and help those Brits. After all, look at this wonderful, winsome woman with her child. But that was only phase one. Phase two was much more important. Phase two involves Lord Beaverbrook, a Churchill intimate, buying Pamela the most extraordinary wardrobe. You'll see one of the dresses in the book, the one that she wears on her first night of the operation. Unfortunately, we don't have a picture of, but I can tell you, was a shoulderless, skin-tight gold lame number, and she looked absolutely amazing in that. She's lost a lot of weight now. The radiance of being at the centre of events has made her look wonderful. She is sent off to the Dorchester Hotel to seduce Avril Harriman, who was in charge of the Lend-Lease programme, the military aid programme that Congress had finally passed. Her job is to do what became known as her mating dance. She had a very specific way of seducing men. Churchill and his wife Clementine had noticed how attractive, appealing she was to older, powerful men. She does her homework. He is in the bag pretty quickly. One of the things that helps is that there is a big raid that night. They're at the Dorset Hotel. He says, let's go down to my suite so we can talk easier. And as he says afterwards, there's nothing like the Blitz to get something going. And as she says afterwards, it was a very fortuitous raid. Well, it has to be said that a few weeks later, or a few months later, when he goes back to Washington, some Americans say to him, what's happened to you? Have you been bewitched or something? You're now unduly pro-British. He was her first victim, target, whatever you want to say. There were many others. Generals, media chiefs, correspondents, spy chiefs. She went for them all. She wasn't seducing sergeants and privates. This was a strategic sex life that now some American professors of diplomacy very much hail as the beginning of the special relationship. So you could say that very special relationship was born between the sheiks of the Dorchester Hotel. Because before the Second World War, and we forget this, it's very easy to forget this, to remember this, but there were no real back channels between London and Washington then. The colonial history very much overshadowed everything. There was a lot of resentment, a lot of, distrust. And so the idea that we would have this kind of network of emotional as well as military and intelligence ties was kind of like a really new idea. It's bizarre to think so now, particularly as we're in danger perhaps of losing that special relationship. But Pamela's special operation was right there and was unbelievably successful. And she was juggling these powerful men with these big egos, the burden of World War on their shoulders brilliantly. There was no scandal. There was no falling out. There were no fisticuffs on the pavement outside. She was often sleeping with several of them at the same time, and she became an intelligence broker. When the Brits and the Americans had a little dispute over bombing techniques leading up to D-Day, she was sleeping also with the head of the RAF as well as the head of bombing in the American Air Force. This was very useful because the pillow talk very much helped to come up to a compromise. She was 20, 21, 22 when she was doing this. I don't know what you were like at that age, but the thought of handling this, she was a phenomenon, but she also learned politics in Downing Street at Churchill's side. Churchill has many faults, as we're all very willing to say these days, but he had one extraordinary talent, which was communication. The way, as Kennedy would say later, he said, he marshaled the English language and sent it into battle. So he did. And so she learnt everything at his side as to what worked, how to bring people together, how to wage a world war with everyone pretty much in the country behind it. So that was her university, if you like. That was her schooling while she was doing this extraordinarily important job.
Okay, so again, a fantastic story you're weaving here, but also the question that pops up with this whole section of the book in the Second World War and the recruiting of American influence to move America across into joining the war, it's unclear to me the degree to which this was sort of sanctioned at the top levels, right? This is obviously very informal. It's scandalous potentially. It's dangerous. I was struggling to understand. I mean, it's very important that the argument you make, but other historians would suggest, isn't this just some side issue? This is just something that happens. Plutocrats and elites, they get together, they share, they have the same sort of telephone numbers, they meet each other, they connect. You're suggesting this is part of a kind of a strategic sort of plan to actually drag a reluctant America into the war. I mean, at what level was this approved of? Do we know, or is it unapproved? Is it sort of unsanctioned?
I mean, it's the sort of thing where you're not going to have a memorandum written out in, this evening Pamela will, seduce Avril Harriman or Bill Paley or whoever it is at precisely 9:32. I mean, it didn't happen like that. And, in war, things happen which are informal, which would never happen in peacetime, but the emergency and the urgency of war mean that you do things. I mean, the original idea, I think, was pretty much hatched between Pamela and Lord Beaverbrook. Pamela owed him a lot of money because Randolph had notched up all his gambling debts, and he wanted to see what she could do towards the war effort. But it quickly became something that Churchill was very much part of and benefited from. So after she often held dinners for various important Americans, he would send a car to pick her up. She'd go to Downing Street, and you know how he loved staying up late at night. They would play Bezique. They were both. She used to let him win. She was very good at Bezique. But that was sort of, diplomatic. But she would pass on the information that she had gleaned from the Americans. And we know that. And we know that from lots of different sources, including Bill Walton, who was a Time Life correspondent back then and was very, very close to her, saw it in action. But it's in various people's diaries as well. And she herself, in hitherto unpublished interviews, talked about what she was doing, and Churchill paid her a pension for the rest of his life out of his own pocket in gratitude, for what she had done.
That's extraordinary. Thanks so much for that. I wonder if it might be time to ask any questions for audience. We've got a hand going up here, so straight away, that's great. If you could say who you are as well, if you'd like, and then ask a question to Sonia.
Well, I mean, who I am is not really important, but I'm a local PhD student. My question is more, so, she's sort of married into the Churchill family, pretty quickly realises that her new husband is a drunkard, not particularly useful to her, makes her way into the sort of centre of the family, becomes friends with Winston Churchill. And she obviously then sort of weaponises her sex to take information and such. Is there any actual sort of record of what her husband thought about any of this? I mean,
yes.
Churchill seems to be, like, the father Churchill seems to be on board. I'd quite like to know what the husband thought about all of this.
Okay, well, I mean, that's a really good question. As you can imagine, when Randolph heard about it, I mean, for a long time, Winston and Clementine Churchill tried to keep Randolph away. So his regiment was sent abroad, he was sent to Cairo, various other things, because they wanted him out of the way. But eventually he comes back, he gets injured, he comes back, he goes to the bar at White's Club where everyone is talking about Pamela's sex life, and he realises that he's a cuckold. And, perhaps unsurprisingly, he goes berserk. He slaps his own sister, he rages at his parents. He never forgives his parents, even into the 60s, long after the war and shortly before Churchill dies. He still says, "You privileged the national interest over my marriage. You condoned what my wife was doing under your roof. In fact, you encouraged it." All of this is true. But let's just go back to the situation that these people found themselves in. As soon as Pamela marries Randolph, she pretty realises that he's violent, he's abusive, he's unfaithful, he's a drunk. The night that she gave birth during a huge air raid at Chequers, he was in bed with someone else and couldn't be found. He beat up his second wife, we know that for sure, and Pamela talked about him being rough and cruel. No one ever at this point thinks that that marriage is going to survive. The only reason why divorce doesn't come immediately is because Pamela didn't want to put any more burden on the Churchills as they were waging a world war. And the fact was, and Churchill himself always put the national interest above everything else. One of his private secretaries said that, he loved his family, but his purposes, as he put it, always came first. And Pamela, too, was very much of that thinking. We need to save this country because we faced invasion, we faced annihilation, we faced, the threat of tyranny. So the normal rules do not apply. But it's not as if that, Randolph had been a good husband. He had not. I mean, had he been a good husband, I think it would have been a very different thing. But yes, it is shocking. But yes, you have to think about it in the context of the time. If it was going on now, we would probably think very, very differently to how we should probably think about it in the Second World War when, cities were being blitzed every night. I mean, there were 57 consecutive nights at one point in London of the Blitz. Thousands and thousands of people were dying. You think about what's happening in Ukraine now and you think you transplant that to here. What would you perhaps do to save your friends, your family, your country? So I think you just have to think about it in a different way.
Thank you. So that's a great question. I guess the book continues, and there's so much in there, and such a complicated and interesting career and life that she had. I wonder if we can move to explore, the post-war and the kind of transition that Pamela goes through from this kind of, this young, highly sexualized character involved in various different kinds of political intrigue to kind of becoming a professional, sort of professional background connector, a spotter of political talent. And the move to when she moves over to the United States becomes wrapped up in Democratic Party circles, etc. I was fascinated by this personal transition. I mean, you don't always get a very close feel for her in terms of her own words in the text, but you do get a feel of a transition of a person, a change of a personality, a change in style, a change in position, a change in kind of approach to how she sees herself. So would you comment on that a little bit, please?
Yeah, I mean, again, we're talking about the 20th century. So, as a woman, she had very limited opportunities at the end of the war. A lot of women felt really quite apprehensive when peace came because this meant that their lives were going to shrink back again to pre-war conditions. Pamela was certainly no exception to that. And when Churchill was chucked out by the electorate in 1945, she wondered whether she was ever going to have an interesting and purposeful life again. She was now divorced. She did have a small child. She didn't have any money. It's not as if she could just go and get a job at NATO that was being set up. No, she couldn't talk about what she'd been doing, obviously. Couldn't put that down on a CV. She had nothing else to tell anyone. So what was she good at? Well, she was good at seducing people. We know that. So what does she do? She started seducing lots of people, thinking this is a way to get to an interesting life. The only way is through a man with an interesting life. And so she seduced all manner of men. Ali Khan, Gianni Agnelli, head of Fiat, a Rothschild, the odd Greek shipping tycoon, various others, always trying to find a purpose. She helped Gianni Agnelli hugely. He Italian alongside the war. Fiat was likely to be confiscated from him by the Allies because it had greatly prospered from supplying Hitler and Mussolini, and she helped him rehabilitate himself and Fiat, introduced him to JFK, who she'd become very friendly with, and I'll leave you to decide how friendly when you read a certain passage in Ireland, and many others. So she had this extraordinary network, and people could see that she understood politics, how to be an international statesman, even if she herself couldn't be one. Well, in the end, being a courtesan, because actually, in a way, that's what she was, people called her at least, she got rather tired of that. So she moved to the States, married someone in show business. That was not a terribly successful marriage, but she did the best she could for him, and then finds Avril Harriman again. By this point, a Democratic elder statesman, very good in some things, but not very good at politics. Good at policy, maybe, but not politics. She now sees her chance, this entree into the Democratic Party, where power is now in Washington. It's not really in London anymore. She enjoys power. She finds it thrilling. When Reagan gets in 1980, a big Republican landslide, the Democrats are despondent, just as they are now, maybe even more now, but, similar kind of levels. But she sees one man. Everyone else writes him off. He'd only been governor of a small state for 2 years, and then he lost. He's a bit of a rough, edges, a bit of a messy private life. She knows about that fully. But she has what she once saw in Churchill. And by the way, there are similarities. They're both sinners, not saints, as we know. But she could see that this man could potentially be the answer. He had a way of just appealing to people, and you were in a room with him, he lit the room up and everyone wanted to talk to him, and he made the person he was talking to feel like $1 million. Everyone said, you're crazy. But for 12 years, she worked with him, she fundraised for him, she talked policy with him, she projected him around Washington where he wasn't well known. She introduced him to all the right people. Who am I talking about? Clinton, yeah. And eventually, as you all know, he ended that Republican streak in 1992. And when I spoke to him, I said, how important was Pamela in that process? And he said, oh, she got me into the White House, no doubt about it. So this woman who'd been so close to Churchill in Britain in the 1940s was now as close, pretty much, to the centre of power in America 50 years later. I don't think there is anyone else that you can say that about. Particularly no other woman, but probably no other person has had that kind of power over that length of time in 2 different countries. And Clinton makes her, to say thank you, makes her the American ambassador. By this point, she has American citizenship to France. This is her first formal job, and she's 73. So anyone wanting to embark on a new career, you have plenty of time, believe me. So off she goes to Paris at the age of 73, where she becomes incredibly close to Chirac. So she's now very close to Chirac and Clinton, and this becomes very, very important because in the mid-90s, easy to forget now, this terrible thing is happening, which is the genocide, the ethnic cleansing in the Balkans. And again, all the peace processes have failed, and somehow the West really needs to get its act together. And that's where Pamela, once again, comes in and plays a huge role.
Thank you, that's great. Have you got any other questions from the audience at this point? And you could go again if you like. If there's anyone else. No? Please jump in again if you'd like to, yeah.
Did she sort of remain in contact with Winston Churchill later in her life? Because I know you mentioned they're paying a pension, but I wonder how much of her sort of interactions after she left for the US was then sort of influenced by her relationship, that if it was still continuing with Winston back and
another really good question. Winston was not terribly keen on Agnelli to begin with. He called him that dreadful Italian car mechanic and couldn't understand why Pamela was running around with him because, as I say, he had been an enemy, only a couple of years beforehand. But Pamela, showing her diplomatic skills, eventually persuades the old man to meet Agnelli, sort of arguing that Fiat could be a bulwark against communism. Everyone thought that Italy might go communist in 1948. The elections then were really kind of knife edge. The Allies were very worried about what might happen then because the Italian economy, there was a lot of suffering. The Italian economy was on the floor, and Pamela persuaded Churchill, well, actually, we need to boost Agnelli, we need to boost Fiat to bring Italy back into the fold. So she saw him then, but every time, it's very interesting, I spoke to a lot of his staff who were still alive. We keep losing them, but before we do lose them, I talked to them, that she always cheered him up. He was very depressed in those post-war years, even when he managed to get back to Downing Street in the 1950s, and yet there was something about her that just sort of energized him. And so, yes, they did see each other really quite often, even though Randolph didn't like it at all and it had to be discreet, but they continued to be very, very close. And after Churchill died, Pamela would continue to be very, very close to Clementine. And it was actually through writing my book about Clementine that I first realised just how important Pamela had been to both of them, and how she had actually been much more of a pillar of their whole war effort than their own kids had been. And so it was, very much through Clementine that I found that out. So yeah, they remained very close until Clementine died in, I think it was 1980.
Anybody else like to ask a question to Sonia? Please, there's a gentleman here. If you can.
Yeah.
Does she have any living descendants? And if so, do you know what they think of your book?
Well, that's a very interesting question. She does. So young Winston, her son, died in 2010, but his children are still around and they have children themselves. Initially, I know they were really worried because there have been 2 previous books about Pamela that were written before she died, without talking to Clinton, without talking to Chirac's people, without talking to, by the way, Nelson Mandela. She was incredibly helpful to in his electoral campaign. All sorts of people and papers that weren't available before. And those 2 books are some of the most... They're kind of full of hate, to be honest. Pamela is a very divisive figure, and those 2 books are really excoriating about her. So they were terrified in case I wrote the same thing, but I had the benefit of knowing much more about what went on behind closed doors. Because from the outside, it can just look like she spent the war, swanning around in beautiful frocks and, hanging out with the beautiful people. And, yeah, and that is what she was doing, but for a very, very strategic and patriotic purpose, and yet that was not known before. So I think they were worried about that, but now I've had several messages from them saying how much they love the book and how little they realised just, how important she had become. So that's great. And then through her sisters as well. In fact, I'm going up to Mull, the Isle of Mull, in October for the literary festival up there, and some of her great nieces and nephews live up there, and it was their idea that I come up and talk about her, because no one has actually really written before about what she did. I mean, just to give you the idea about Nelson Mandela, no one knew about that, but I found these transcripts of her conversations with him in her papers at the Library of Congress, only just released before COVID. It was all a bit tricky, where there's a transcript of a phone call comes in from South Africa to her house in Washington, and basically, I mean, just to give you the gist, this is before the first multiracial elections. He thinks the ANC are going to lose, which is just a prospect that never really occurred to me. They had no candidates, they had no infrastructure, they had no money, they had no policies, they had no clue how to run an election. So who do they go to? Pamela, because they saw that she got Clinton into the White House, and Mandela comes to her house, she organises a big meeting, and they have this incredible relationship. That was never known before. So there's all sorts, because she didn't brag about it, so there's all sorts of things that, have come out subsequently, and it's lovely to hear that her family are thrilled about this coming out. Yeah, I'm really pleased about that.
That's a really interesting point, and I was going to relate to something I was going to ask you too. It's about, I guess we're in a university, I guess a technical kind of question, a historical kind of question, is that history is the sources, but also the interpretation of the sources, right? So partly a lot of Pamela's life is secret. A lot of it isn't disclosed, as you said a moment ago. So you have some sources, Library of Congress, Kew Gardens, etc., maybe oral history, you've got letters, you've got some people you must have interviewed as well, who really must have known her. But then you're also doing a piece of revisionist history. You're not writing the scurrilous critique of a very kind of complex and controversial character.
I'm not saying she was a saint,
no,
by
of course,
the way. Yeah,
of course not.
In any
that's
way.
absolutely clear. That's absolutely clear.
Yeah.
And that's really interesting how you do that. And it's very much up to the reader to figure out do I like Pamela or not, right? It's something you kind of go through while reading it. But the question I have is that, to what extent are you thinking about telling a unique narrative with, okay, some of the sources are new, some are already known, but you're deliberately having to tell a different type of history? What's going through your mind when you do that?
So much of the history of the 20th century is written from a male perspective for, very obvious reasons. And what has occurred to me more and more as I've written the last 3 books in particular is it's not the full picture. So you cannot understand Winston Churchill without knowing about his wife. She helped to write those speeches. She edited them, she rehearsed them with him, she told him he had to use words that were understandable by someone with only an elementary education that wouldn't have to resort to a dictionary. That was all Clementine's idea. And yet, if you go to a book called The Greatest Britain Unmasked, it's 800 pages long. You look in the index, how often does it mention Winston Churchill's wife?
Never.
None. Not once. And yet he's called The Greatest Britain Unmasked. Now, you may or may not think that he is the greatest Britain, but he's obviously still a huge historical figure. You cannot understand him at all without Clementine. He himself said in 1948 that nothing in his life would have been possible without her. And so that made me think, well, who else, is out there that actually has had a bad press? Because, when she is mentioned, she's often described as shrill and irrelevant, Clementine. And then I went on to Virginia Hall, my book, A Woman of No Importance, an extraordinary American woman who'd lost her leg in a hunting accident. She literally shot herself in the foot and ends up becoming the Gestapo's most wanted agent, the agent that they think is the most dangerous of all in France during the war. And yes, she'd had some attention, but my goodness, very little considering what she ended up doing. You should read the book. I mean, she blew up bridges, she did jailbreaks. At one point, she was pretty much the only Allied secret agent left in France, and she carried the whole thing on her shoulders. And then you come to Pamela, who is just written off as the wife of the British ambassador in Paris in the 1950s once put it, "I will not have that red-headed tart in my house." Now, her daughter phoned me up, Cella de Rosnay, the other day in great agitation and said, "No, I've read your book. I can't believe Mummy ever said that." But that's what people thought. She was a red-headed tart. There were prejudices, there were presumptions about her. Women were not supposed to do what she did. Well, I think it's about time we kind of have another look at what it was that she did and why she did it, and how much we, all of us, actually benefited from it. So that's kind of why I'm trying to write these histories. I'm not saying that these women were perfect. My goodness me, they were not. But what they achieved has never been properly recognised. They were huge figures in their own way, in a big way. And I think there are many more stories out there that haven't been told. It's, quite often when I go to there's a panel or something at a festival, it's something about war or espionage or whatever. I'm the only woman on it, and I feel like a bit of a token. And now we've got the women's perspective. No, it isn't. It's proper history. It's what really happened, and that's a message I'm trying to get across. Is that whether or not you approve of what Pamela did, she was a big player. She really was. And we should know about that.
Fantastic answer. Thank you so much.
There's a lady to say.
Please.
It's fascinating, absolutely fascinating. A bit of an intrusive question in many ways. Did her health suffer? I mean, obviously, we know a lot now about diseases and so forth. And did she get pregnant to any of these other
Well, that's
people?
a really good...
Yeah.
We don't know. The answer to that is... But there are several unexplained absences during the war. Now, we know abortion was illegal then, but we know it went on all the time. I mean, everyone was at it during the war because you might die in 5 minutes, so why not? All the taboos went about sex outside marriage. The abortion was commonplace she would have been able to afford better services than some women. We don't know, but I suspect she definitely did. One abortion we do know about is that one that she had with Gianni Agnelli, and we also know that in her 30s she was suspected of having cervical cancer, which was hugely common at the time. Evita Peron died from it, all the rest of it, and she had a hysterectomy. That may be through some of the birth control that was being used at that point, which was sometimes blamed for this sort of terrible epidemic of cervical cancer. We don't know. One thing we do know is that her health generally, from everything that she did and the brickbats, the attacks that she had, was quite fragile. And eventually, when she dies in Paris in 1997 in February, it's almost certainly brought about by stress. She was swimming in the pool at the Ritz in Paris, which was the one thing that she did to counterbalance that very, very difficult job that she was doing. She has an aneurysm. The guy who's at the hotel in charge of dealing with it has Chirac on one phone, Clinton on the other, thinking, what on earth is going on? Has to deal with all of this, get her to the American hospital in Neuilly. He does such a good job, deals with it so well, that 6 months later he is given the job of driving Princess Diana. As we know, he didn't do so well that night, probably been at the bar, we don't know. But that was Henri Paul. And it was because he dealt with the crisis of Pamela so well. So it's extraordinary how her life touches so many others, whether it's Frank Sinatra or Joe Biden or JFK. Almost think of a 20th century character, and in some way Pamela, I mean, she saved JFK's life as well. I mean, that's another story. It's just extraordinary. She never just sat at home and watched TV, as far as I can tell. Yeah.
When I was putting this session together, I kind of gave it this sort of leadership spin. This idea of how do we contextualize this? There's so many themes in the book. You have many different themes, right? But one thing that grows a lot as the book unfolds is this idea of sort of her innate sense of how power works and how to spot someone with a kind of X factor, right? Someone who has some kind of leadership abilities, has some kind of influence or charisma or whatever it might be. I wonder if you can comment on that element a little bit and the conversation we've had subsequently about this in terms of what kind of leadership figures are we kind of crying out for? I mean, Pamela herself is this kingmaker figure, right? So she's in the background. But nevertheless, she tells us something important about the leadership figures we want or deserve or don't get. I wonder if you can comment on a broad question, but if you know what I'm getting at.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. I mean, on Clinton, as I looked this up the other day, that Trump is talking about how many $1 trillion deficit they've got. The last president to balance the books, by the way, was Clinton, which is extraordinarily interesting. But her house in Georgetown in Washington someone described it as a paddock where contenders for the presidency, to run for president, would be put through their paces in her drawing room. It rather helped that she had a Van Gogh, the white roses, over her mantelpiece, thanks to her husband, because everyone wanted to come and see that, and her, because she was very famous. But then they would have to perform. They'd have to give a little sort of spiel about something. And there was one contender, Bill Bradley, he was considered, a very likely runner for the presidency, and he rocked up at N Street where the house is. You can go and look at the outside; it's quite interesting. And put one elbow on the mantelpiece underneath the Van Gogh and opened his mouth. The fire was lit. It was midwinter, and as someone who was there told me, it was like the fire just went out. He was so boring that someone asked Clinton to kind of pretty much take over because they could rely on him to be entertaining and interesting. So if you failed in that drawing room, and that was it for Bill Bradley, no one pretty much ever heard of him again, if you failed, that was it. If you succeeded, then she took an interest in you. but you had to stay the course. She took an interest in Gary Hart at one point as being a contender, and then he got involved in a sex scandal, so she dropped him. And she was always terrified that Clinton would get too, involved in scandal before he actually made it to the White House. And that was always touch and go. In fact, on one occasion, he often stayed in her house when he was in Washington, when he was still governor in Arkansas. On one occasion, he brought a woman in to stay overnight, and she tore a strip off him. She was absolutely furious. You're probably thinking, well, hang on a minute, that's a bit hypocritical. But A, she didn't want him treating Hillary like that. But B, what are you doing? You are going to run for president. Why are you making stupid errors like this? Never do it again. And he didn't. So, but she saw in him this thing, as I mentioned, she had herself. In fact, someone who was sort of an advisor to them both said when they used to walk around arm in arm, and it was a bit like a supernova, this kind of electricity, both of them. Both of them had this, as he put it, regal presence. They would go up to someone, talk to them, and that person would feel fantastic. And she would go up to senators and say, I'd love it, doing her mating dance thing again. I'd love it if you do X, Y, Z. And apparently they went away feeling terrific and did X, Y, Z the very next day. And so she recognized in others what she had herself, which was this X factor, this star quality. And she realized it's not enough to be a technocrat. Hello, Mr. Starmer. But, you need to bring people on side. You need to excite them. You need to know what makes them tick. And Clinton won because even though Bush had won the first Gulf War, blah, 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 he had a huge approval rating of 90% or whatever it was, they could see that people's interests weren't really about that. They were more about keeping their job or getting another one or paying their mortgage or the rent or getting their kids into a decent school. And therefore it was a domestic thing, was an economic thing. It's the economy stupid that actually won the election rather than the fact that the Gulf War had been won. A bit like, as she told them repeatedly, Churchill in 1945. Churchill won the war, but didn't win the election. Why was that? Because people were bored with war. They didn't want to think about it anymore. They wanted a nice house with a garden and their two kids having a great schooling. And it was that lesson that she'd learned at Churchill's side, which unbelievably, and many Democrats told me this, was reapplied in America in 1992. Thanks to Pamela.
That's fascinating. Any more questions from the audience, please? We've got somebody down here, if that's okay.
It occurred to me when you were talking about her background that there's similarities with the Mitford family, who also didn't have any education but went on to do extraordinary things in their own way. And I wonder, in a university setting, you'd like to comment on the lack of formal education when applied to people of great ability and what that tells us about creativity and future development of that person.
That's another really interesting question. Thank you. Pamela always regretted throughout her life that she hadn't had a university education. It always really worried her. When she first started getting involved in the Democratic Party, shenanigans, she was terrified of going on TV up against those silver-tongued university graduates. She needn't have worried because she probably could deal with them pretty well. But she did have that imposter syndrome that, a lot of us have, even if we have been to university. What she did about it is an option not available to most of us. She married a very rich man and then persuaded him to give $11 million to Columbia University so that she could then go and, pummel university lecturers whenever she felt like and say, well, what about this? Explain that to me. Well, what about Russia? What about this? And they, of course, having received $11 million, were only too happy to answer her questions. So in a sense, in her 60s, she did finally get a sort of university education, but it was something, a lack she was acutely aware of. And when she was appointed ambassador to Paris, there was a lot of talk. Well, why are you sending that woman? She doesn't know anything. She's got no school qualifications, let alone university educations. And Clinton had to come out and say she has plenty of qualifications of a different sort in order to justify his appointment. But, it was difficult for her. So, yes, she had this creative brain. And, yes, she got herself into a situation where she learned from Churchill and then, later on was able to use that learning in a very different environment in America. But I'm sure if she were here right now, if you asked her, would you have liked to have gone to university? Oh, yes, she would. So she found a way to train her brain and to fill it with information and ideas, but she keenly felt all the time that she had something to be ashamed of in the sort of circles that she was mixing in. I mean, that's really sad and wrong in some ways, but that is how she felt very acutely. Yeah. And so that made her workaholic, by the way. She always felt she had to work 6 times harder than anybody else because she had to prove herself. I mean, the guy that she replaced as ambassador to France had been to both Yale and Harvard, and as well as being ambassador in other countries. She was going, like I say, her first job at 73. And so she worked like an absolute Trojan to prove that she could do the job. And by getting involved in Bosnia, and this is all explained in the book, the part that she played was extraordinary. And both Clinton said to me directly, yeah, she was a big part in the whole peace effort. And Chirac is no longer with us, but his chief foreign affairs advisor described her role in bringing peace to Bosnia, and I quote, invisible but decisive. So this woman with no education did a great thing, but she felt it deeply.
Okay, moving on quite closely from that, you speak at one section towards the end of the book about, and you mentioned a similar thing now, if Pamela was here now, what would she think? And what would she think about the lack of female leaders right now in business, in government, in civil society generally? I mean, the statistics is something like, 13% of heads of state are women. Surveys of, say, Forbes or Business Week or women leaders. It's often a bit like your experience of being the kind of token person, keep being asked to be the person to speak up for all of the women. The issue of there being maybe CEOs, about 10%, 11% of CEOs in Fortune 500 are going to be women. This issue of a lack of women leaders, there are plenty of interesting examples, but it's about 10%, 15%. Why such lack of progress, I guess?
Yeah, I suspect she would be a bit depressed by that and possibly a bit surprised. When she first started getting really involved in American politics in the 1980s, there was no ladies' loo on the Senate floor in Congress. And for a long time, the only 2 female senators were there because their husbands had held the seat previously. She never believed in what we would now call positive discrimination, in the sense that she didn't think a woman should get the job just because she was a woman. She believed very strongly that there were women out there who were completely deserving of those jobs and they should get the job on their merits rather than their gender. So she was very, very clear-sighted about that. Some people thought she was too kind of rigid on that, but that she certainly believed that. For her, like so many people in the 20th century, this was all a journey. I think possibly it wasn't until she became ambassador to France in 1993, and her number 2 there, and the head of her economic section, and the head of the consular section, just by chance were all women. So she saw them in action, and was amazed at how good they were, and realised there were so many good women out there who were not being promoted, that she became more and more of an advocate and would hold lots of functions at the Paris embassy to try and encourage women to go for more senior, more powerful jobs. Back then, it still seemed a mountain to climb to have a female American president. I think she might be surprised that all these years later, it still seems a huge mountain to climb. She certainly did not share Margaret Thatcher's politics, or even though they both had the 80s power helmet hairstyle at one point. But I found this quite interesting correspondence between the two of them, where they recognised that they were both playing a blinder in what was still very much a man's game, and that it was a lonely place to be, and it certainly was. And so I think she would be disappointed that we still haven't had a female president in the States, and that there are so few around the world, but also recognition to get to that place is often, for a woman that much harder. I mean, I've read various biographies of Margaret Thatcher, and again, I don't share her politics either, but I look at how hard she worked, how late she stayed up. She always tried to make sure that she was better informed than anyone else in the meeting, in any, scenario. And I think probably Pamela knew that, exercised that own discipline herself, and would be, a bit sad that we haven't got closer to parity.
Following up on that, I guess, so you've written about Boris Johnson, Clementine Churchill, Virginia Hall, and Pamela. Who's next? What's on your mind?
I just want to say that my first book about Boris Johnson is a very different. I had the misfortune of working with him back in the 1990s when I was a reporter. I was his number 2 in Brussels when he was making up all those stories about bendy bananas and things. And it was a scarring experience, and I wrote the book, and that was also a scarring experience. So since then, I've wanted to write about people that I could admire, and feel like they've made a positive contribution. So my next, I've taken a little bit of a break, because this book took me 5. This book was not supposed to be this hard, but then I didn't know about the Biden stuff, the JFK stuff, the Nelson Mandela. So it took 5 years, and it was really tough. So I'm taking a little tiny bit of a break before starting my next one. I'm not sure, 100% sure I know who it is, but I'm just working on someone who, again, deserves to be known by you all, did extraordinary things behind the scenes, is little known, and but another amazing life, if not quite on the epic scale of Pamela, because I really believe she's a one-off.
Thank you. Interesting, kind of intriguing non-answer, half answer. I like that. That's very good. You've learned from some of these politicians over the years, right? Any other questions? We're about to run out of time, so maybe another question from the audience. Please. Can we have the JFK?
The JFK. Okay, so there's call here from the audience for the JFK story. Would you like the JFK story? Okay.
I think we've got to hear it.
All right, so there are many JFK stories, but this particular one is that they became very close before the war, during the war, and after the war. His father, as I'm sure you know, was American ambassador in London. Her best friend probably ever was JFK's sister, Kik Kennedy. And Kik Kennedy married the guy who should have been the next Duke of Devonshire, but unfortunately he died in the war. But his parents let her use Lismore Castle in Ireland. They were very, very fond of her. And Pamela and Jack Kennedy went over to stay with Kik in Ireland. And this is just after the war, 1947. Jack's political ambitions were beginning to really take off, and I think he was already thinking about the White House. Anyway, he knew, brilliant politician that he was, always looking to curry the working class vote, even though he was this super privileged person. She learned a lot from him too. So he wanted to go and check out his Irish roots, and he thought he'd found the original Kennedy family that he was related to. And he wanted Pamela to come with him, but told her not to tell Kik or anything. And Kik had this huge station wagon, the only one in Ireland at the time, absolutely vast American car, and they set off. This village was only 30 miles away. Now, even given Irish country lanes, it's a surprise it took 6 hours to get there. As we know, she was the world's probably #1 seducer, and he might be the world's #1, well, shagger, whatever you want to call him. And I couldn't possibly say what they got up to in the 6 hours it took to get to the village where the Kennedy family took place. But I do know that when they eventually got back to Lismore Castle that evening after meeting the Kennedys, he made her swear that she would never say what they'd got up to. So I'm going to leave it all up to you to decide. There are quite a lot more details in the book, but that's basically the gist of it.
Okay, thank you so much. That's a wonderful question to end on. So thank you for Sonia.
Thank you. Thanks.